It felt as though Mark's life force was slowly draining away when the fatigue first appeared. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, and it wasn't entirely unexpected. One afternoon, with his hands braced on his knees, he sat on the pavement outside the studio and wondered when he had become someone who could falter on a Tuesday. It wasn't fainting or collapse, just a quiet exhaustion that pushed him to arrive early for rehearsals and leave long after everyone else. He had always been in motion. His family life was anchored by 1,000 small routines, stages, appointments, deadlines, and laughter drifting from the kitchen. Kelly, his compass and his anchor, moved around him like a steady tide. Together they weathered news cycles and gossip columns, navigating private heartbreaks behind closed doors while presenting a public image built on sharp humor and hard-earned compassion. Their home was filled with jokes, coffee, and a shared shorthand born of years spent anticipating one another's moves. So when Mark finally admitted to Kelly that he'd been sick for weeks, she listened with a devotion that calmed him. He tried to soften the moment with one of his familiar jokes, the kind that blunted anxiety, perched on the kitchen island as sunlight spilled across the butcher block counter. Kelly laughed, weakly at first, then steadier. In a world where humor was essential to both of them, she became the stabilizing force, elbows planted firmly on the counter. "You're going to get checked," she said, without hesitation. Part of him bristled at her decisiveness, yet he couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The first round of tests brought conflicting answers, minor warnings, troubling indicators, and recommendations for further evaluation. The waiting rooms at the medical complex blurred together, filled with the hum of vending machines, uninspired lullabies, and magazines older than their grandchildren's baby photos. When the specialist finally sat across from Mark, his voice was calm and measured. He explained imaging, probabilities, and biopsies with a careful objectivity of someone whose job was to deliver fragile truths. The diagnosis arrived like a storm alert, clinical, precise, and devastating. The shadow that had followed Mark each morning was finally named. The word itself carried weight, unfamiliar and sharp, settling on his tongue like a swallowed stone. It didn't redefine him, as some believed illness could. It changed everything, but it neither weakened him nor sanctified him. Conversations that once flowed freely now required caution. Their children's voices seemed more delicate. Schedules were reshaped by a new sense of urgency. Kelly became both shield and sanctuary. Just as she absorbed scripts, she went into overdrive, learning medical language quickly and intensely, focused entirely on easing the burden for those she loved. She read relentlessly, scoured late-night forums, took meticulous notes at appointments, and challenged doctors with pointed questions. And still, when the house finally went quiet, she would sit beside Mark in silence, offering nothing more than her steady presence. On sleepless nights, she rested her palm against his chest, tracing the familiar lines of his tattoos as if mapping him anew. Those small gestures carried a quiet resolve. They would not face this alone. Public life, however, came with its own consequences. Curiosity and rumor, like engines, ran loudest in silence. Mark and Kelly had long practiced keeping private lives private, but now every detail felt weighted. What to share, when, and how much. Agents and public relations advisors presented options with clinical efficiency, requests for privacy, advocacy statements, carefully shaped disclosures. They wanted none of the spectacle, none of the sympathetic spotlight. Adding the diagnosis to the endless news cycle felt unbearable. Their only path forward was honesty without theatrics. In their joint statement, they made a quiet promise to be truthful when it served understanding, to protect their children from rumor, and to use their platform only where it might illuminate something larger than themselves. The facts would speak plainly,
without turning the personal into performance. The announcement rippled outward. Messages poured in from fans. Strangers offered prayers. Headlines reshaped the story again and again, altering tone as easily as a phone filter. Their home transformed into both refuge and point of fascination. No cameras stood at the gate, yet the conversation had moved into spaces they could never fully enter, despite their wishes. From the beginning, Mark held on to a single image, himself on a dark stage, one light overhead, casting a long shadow across the floor. After the upheaval of treatment, he weighed returning to that stage or choosing an entirely different one. The diagnosis marked a new era, one where old certainties no longer applied. He learned to move forward with equal parts grace and
Treatment was
determination.
more grounded than the tabloids predicted. Some days blurred into calendars ruled by appointments, yet moments still pierced the routine. Callie would bring in a tray of leftovers, sit on the edge of the bed, and tell an intentionally corny story, anything to remind them they were more than patients in a medical building. A poem, a joke, an old drawing, laughter became the small opening that let light in, a necessary act of survival. Their children met the news with a mix of curiosity and quiet sadness. Older now, their questions were direct, often practical. Their presence restored a sense of normalcy. Between school plays, homework deadlines, and soccer games, Mark sat in the sun on a folding chair, hands resting on his knees, savoring the feel of grass and sneakers. Friends became a lifeline. Colleagues brought meals and memories. Co-hosts quietly filled in so Mark could rest. Backstage conversations softened, filled with empathy instead of cynicism. They prayed together, laughed together, and sometimes cried. The industry could be harsh, but when it slowed, it revealed itself as a community. Hope and fear intertwined. Some scans improved, others didn't. Side effects reshaped hunger, energy, even hair, making mirrors unfamiliar. Some nights Mark startled at his reflection, unsure who stared back. Through it all, Kelly's face remained constant, tired, yes, but unwavering, the same face that loved him before the diagnosis, during it, and beyond it. There were moments of anger, too, at biology, at randomness, at the unfairness of fate, especially for a body that had once been strong and reliable. Mark snapped over small things. Loss often announced itself as frustration, a headline, a missed call, an offhand remark. Kelly redirected that energy into action, rescheduling appointments, calling doctors, planning small rebellions like a spontaneous day trip, calendar be damned. One afternoon during treatment, Mark pulled out a notebook he hadn't touched in years. Doodling had once been his refuge, a way through childhood fears and adult setbacks alike. The sketchbook felt like confession, private, forgiving, safe. He drew Kelly laughing at breakfast, her hair falling just so. He sketched their children as wide-eyed, energetic figures. He drew their house as a fortress, not of stone, but of glass, transparent, yet selective about what it allowed inside. That night, the family gathered in the living room to watch a familiar movie. Kelly curled beside him, her head on his shoulder, her breathing steady and calm. In that quiet, Mark understood that the diagnosis had given them something unexpected, an acute awareness of the present. Lingering worries dissolved. Everyday details, a coffee cup, a child's joke, the slant of afternoon light, took on sacred weight. Some questioned the sensitivity afforded to celebrities. Inside their home, those distant debates faded into irrelevance. This was not a story of battles or wars, but of composed, persistent endurance. Mark no longer saw his life as a straight line of milestones, but as a mosaic of small, luminous moments. Sitting with a cup of coffee in the morning felt like a triumph. Each night, Kelly made him laugh until his sides ached. In an industry known for surface-level bonds, sincerity surprised them.
Support came quietly, whispered encouragements from stagehands, home-cooked meals from directors, gestures that required no spotlight at all.